Hello again. So the previous video kind of ended abruptly. There was a glitch with my software, so we're going to pick up right where I was going to tell you about foraging, pastoralism, and horticulture. Not in that order, in this order that I have them written on the board here. So you need to make sure and take really good notes on this because you will be using those notes for your reaction paper and also the quiz. And oh yeah, that you are watching this video at the time of year when the midterm test is coming up, maybe quickly. So make sure that you always keep those really good notes. So that you can have them as your open notes and open book when you're doing your quiz and reaction paper projects and that midterm test and final later on. Okay, so foraging, horticulture, and pastoralism, these are types of subsistence strategies. Foraging is the oldest one, and I'm not sure whether the previous video caught me saying that it means hunting and gathering, or that's what the headline or the subtitle is going to be in your textbook when it talks about foraging, hunting and gathering. That includes any kind of resource that's in the environment that humans can use for food or shelter or clothing, those kinds of things. So foraging is much more than merely gathering berries and shooting squirrels with slingshots. It's much more than that. In a forager society, you have a very, very respectful relationship with the natural environment. You have a high level of knowledge that you gain just in your daily life through interaction with people around you. You have a very high level of knowledge about the natural cycles of plants and animals in your area. Foragers are typically nomadic because if in a society or, a geographic location like Arkansas, if you were part of a foraging society years ago, you would probably pick up and go south when the weather got cold and pick up and go north when the weather got warmer. And you would know when the native plants and animals in Arkansas provided food for you, when this kind of berry or this kind of tomato or this kind of Jerusalem artichoke or amaranth or any of the other things that are native to this area, when would those things be on the vine? Naturally, you would never manipulate the environment to get a higher yield than the natural environment already produces. The same goes for animals. You would have a very high level of knowledge about the life cycle of animals, the reproductive cycle of animals, and you would not overtax that population of animals just to feed your population. Typically, foraging societies, foraging groups. If I say the word society, that probably gives you like an idea that these are large groups of people. No, foragers tend to be very small groups, and they intentionally keep their groups very, very small because that's also a way to not tax the natural environment. They have a really high level of knowledge of medicinal plants, technical uses for plants like ropes or making baskets or fish traps or slings or any of these kinds of things. They use every single aspect of an animal, from the hide to the bones to the antlers to the teeth. They have a use for all of these things, and it's a very respectful and conservation minded. That's the word that I was looking for. Conservation minded kind of relationship with the environment, and there is no concept of sustainability that we have to work toward in a foraging society because the entire way of life, the entire plan for food getting is entirely sustainable. That is what your focus is: sustain your population, but without over harvesting the natural cycle of plants and animals that are available to you in your natural environment. There's tons. Like, we don't have the knowledge because we don't grow up following people around who are, when we're little, we're not following people around who are gathering from the natural environment or hunting from the natural resources in the area. So we don't learn these things. We don't sit around with people while they're making fish traps or while they're making the kinds of tools that are necessary to, from an atlatl to a sling to spears to arrows, all these different kinds of things that are used historically in hunting and gathering activities. So these are the kinds of things that people do on a daily basis, and you don't gather more than you need. You don't store anything for a rainy day. You get it pretty much every 24-hour period. Your job is to get what you need, and the people who are responsible, you are responsible for, get what they need also. And everybody has a job. Everybody has a really high social standing, because whether you're a teeny tiny kid or a really, really old lady, the old lady has tons of knowledge that they can pass from one generation to the next, and the little kid has to come around and help however they can, because they are going to be the future adult that makes sure that the hunting and gathering continues and life goes on from one generation to the next. So foraging is part of our heritage, our very ancient heritage, because up to about 13,000 years ago, that's what the YA means here, years ago, that's the only way that human societies supported themselves, was through foraging. Now, horticulture, the archaeology record indicates that horticulture came on the cultural scene in the USA. There are several different cultural hearths where horticulture is found in the archaeology record up to about 13,000 years ago. This is the small scale, not for surplus, but the small scale production of plants. So it's small scale cultivation of plants, typically some staple crops that your group, your immediate social group, your community, small numbers, but larger, able to sustain larger than a foraging society. Your small community works together to produce staple crops so that you have a more consistent and predictable calorie supply that is not merely linked to the natural cycle of plants and animal reproduction in the natural world. Because sometimes, you know, that things can wipe out plants or animals. Grasshoppers come through and wipe out some kind of vegetation that you used to survive off of. Well, you can eat the grasshoppers. That might gross out some of you, but they're perfectly edible. So you can eat the grasshoppers, and you would have that knowledge back here. Horticulturalists would also, because hunting and gathering is going to be part of the horticultural experience. They aren't going to eliminate, this is not a vegan way of life. They're not going to eliminate meat from their diet. They have meat in their diet, but they are not controlling the animal population yet. They are not engaged in animal husbandry, which actually a pastoralist is. So horticulture, you get to be sedentary in a sedentary village or a sedentary community where permanent housing structures are possible. That's what happens. That's the change or the cultural shift that you see with horticulture. Foraging, typically, you're going to end up being nomadic. Some cultures, you know, depending upon where you exist in the world and how much variation there is from winter to summer, you might not have to be so nomadic. You could maybe stay in one general place if you have plenty, if you're in the rainforest, for instance. But horticulture, you definitely have to stay in one general location and use the land around that general location to produce the base calories that your community needs. Population can go up slightly, but we're really only talking about, you know, like 40 to 50 here as a max, maybe like 400 as a max here. Max. Here, probably 4,000 could be a maximum for a pastoralist society. Pastoralism is animal husbandry. You manage herd animals, things like cows, goats, sheep, yaks, camels, these kinds of things. Not dogs, not pigs, not these kinds of things that are not herding animals, but animals that you can keep in a herd are pastoralists. We've read about this in the past, especially in the migration chapter, because many pastoral societies that still exist today have something called transhumance pastoralism. That means that they have some people who live in sedentary places, but then segments of their social group who guards the herds will take the herd around to water resources, food resources, and travel with the herd during the year and only come back to the sedentary village periodically. And so this we see evidence in the archaeology record about 8,000 years ago. 8,000, 9,000 years ago, we see evidence that pastoralism exists and that animal husbandry, managing herds of animals, where the bulk of your calories comes from these animal resources. Typically not meat all the time. Meat is pretty much a specialized thing, or like for special occasions kind of thing, or when an animal gets old and unuseful for reproduction, you can eat that animal. But typically you use the sustainable or the renewable resources that the animal provides. From the blood, yes, you can harvest blood and keep an animal alive, and use the blood in a variety of different ways. Drinking it, mixing it with the Maasai in East Africa. I remember they mix it with like a honey wine and drink blood. You can use, of course, any of the dairy products that are available. And also cow dung is a very, very useful resource for building, for heating, for cooking. It's a really great resource that pastoralists know very well how to use and take advantage of. So these three subsistence strategies do not use at all. Sorry, I was looking at the timer there. These three subsistence strategies do not focus on surplus production of food, and the population is pretty low for each of these populations because they are either not manipulating the environment at all, the natural cycle at all, like we said in this case, or it's very, very little manipulation of the natural environment. Horticulture, for instance, uses a lot of land, but they don't keep that land they don't keep all of it in production all the time. They let some land lie fallow for 20, 30 years where big, huge trees and all kinds of underbrush grows up. And then they kind of rotate from one field or one production area to the next. And when they get to a place where all these trees have grown up, they'll cut those trees down, they'll burn it off because the ash is such wonderful natural fertilizer for the soil that they're going to cultivate again for another 5 years or so before they move to another one where they haven't been for 30 years. And so constantly you have like this natural regrowth, cutting, slashing and burning is what they call it, the Swidden horticulture. But this is still a very sustainable way. It sounds violent. It sounds like it's environmental terrorism to some people who haven't studied it very much. But it's actually a very sustainable way to produce natural fertilizer and let ecosystems take back over in a particular area that you're not going to use for 20 or 30 years because you keep your population low and you don't produce a surplus. In pastoralism, the animals, like I said, you don't eat them very often, but you do harvest the resources that they can provide while they're still alive. Animals tend to be the wealth that people have. Land is not owned in any of these subsistence strategies. You just have a general idea that there's a territory where you can take your herd animals to get water, to get food. There is a general understanding that there is a particular region where you practice this rotating or switching cultivation centers from one field to the next. And there's a general idea that this is the land that your particular community uses. There's a general idea that that's where your herd of animals is going to pasture, is going to be traveling across the land. But there is no fence. There is no boundary on a map that says you can or cannot cross here. These concepts are such a different mindset than you and I have, because we have fences up, we have streets, we have lines on a map that matter for a variety of reasons, but these folks don't really have lines on a map, privacy fences, property lines. These kinds of things are not part of their cultural makeup because pretty much food in these I'm going to say this. Food in these subsistence strategies is considered a human right. A human right. I mean, think about that. You need food to eat. These subsistence strategies not only are highly sustainable and eco-friendly, but it also looks at food as a human right. You don't see vast poverty at all. Pretty much everybody's level. You don't even see huge inequality in the gender functions or aged to youth populations. You don't see huge inequality in societies like this. Inequality usually exists, but it is not like hugely different where some people are being oppressed by others. Food is considered to be a human right, and it's a completely different mindset that you and I typically can't wrap our brains around.